The administration just announced that they're going to be evaluating whether they thought the development of COVID vaccines in Operation Warp Speed was actually worth it. Because of the people who are currently advising the administration, I suspect we're in store for a lot of revisionist history. So I thought I'd put out a little primer on my take on why the COVID policy was riddled with so many failures that even though there were a lot of scientific successes, the policy decisions made during it ended up leaving a bad taste in everybody's mouth. When COVID first came out, we didn't know what we were dealing with, all right? All we knew was that a lot of people were getting sick really fast and some people's lives were ending, right? And one of the more recent, disease outbreaks in memory was actually Ebola, which is an incredibly deadly disease. And so we didn't know if we were dealing with something that was dangerous on that level, right? And so this is a little chart I made looking at the perceived risk of things. So back in 2020, the perceived risk of COVID at the very beginning was very high. So what did the administration at the time do? They tried to put in a lot of possible interventions with the goal of being conservative and trying to save lives. And those interventions were lockdowns, isolation, eventually masks got into play. And so at the time, because of the high perceived risk of the disease and the low perceived risk of just staying home for a little bit and maybe not going to as many parties, that seemed very low. Perceived risk of the disease is very high, so that made sense. Everybody generally agreed, hey, we're all kind of scared, we want to figure this out, maybe we should stay home for a little bit. So that's what I call phase one, or the shock phase, all right? We didn't know what was going on and we tried to get a handle on things. Now what happens in phase two, which I like to call the malaise phase, right, is that all of a sudden we're starting to realize, hey, this isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So the perceived risk of the interventions, the lockdowns, masks, etc., start going up. When it's not just staying home for a few days, few weeks, all of a sudden it's starting to be months and we're saying, oh my goodness, what's going on? You're starting to see the risks of economic things, right? People losing their jobs, right? Restaurants going out of business, things like that. Perceived risk of these interventions is going up, while at the same time, the perceived risk of the disease is going down. It's no longer at the very beginning where we don't know exactly what we're dealing with, all right? At the beginning, now, by the time we get into phase two, we know it's not Ebola, all right? A lot of people are surviving this. It's still very dangerous. We still know it is ending some people's lives. The perceived risk is not zero, it's still pretty high, but it's not like it was in the beginning. So as the perceived risk of the disease is going down, and at the same time, the perceived risk of the interventions is going up. And now we're starting to get at this middle ground where we're saying, oh, wait a minute, is the risk or the cost of our interventions going to rise to be the same as the risk of the disease itself? And now here is where policy came into play. When the policymakers were making decisions, they asked medical scientists, hey, what do we have to do to save lives, all right? You heard this all the time, is the administration was saying, hey, we want to prioritize saving lives. Seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do, right? And so medical scientists were saying, well, you can save lives by doing these interventions, lockdowns, masks, isolation. And that was true. Those things did and do save lives, right? But what I don't think was given the proper weight on a policy standpoint was the risks of those interventions, all right? The risks being economic risks, people losing their jobs, social risks, people not being able to see their friends, not being able to go outside, not being able to see other people smile because they have a mask on, all right? We are social beings. I mean, think about it. What do we do if we want to punish prisoners? We put them in isolation, all right? It's a punishment. It's not a life-ending thing, but it doesn't feel good, all right? So these are non-zero cost or non-zero risk interventions, but that was not likely given in retrospect as much weight as maybe it should have. And so people may blame scientists for some of these policy decisions, But what this is administration was asking scientists, how do we save lives? And the scientists told them, this is how we save lives. They didn't ask the scientists, hey, how do we keep people to maintain their social connections? How do we make sure that people don't lose their jobs? How do we make sure that restaurants stay open? Those were not questions that were directed to scientists. What we have here is a situation when the scientists were asked to do a specific thing. They were asked about a specific outcome, saving lives, and they told the administration, hey, this is what you want to do if you want to save lives, and the administration decided to act on that as their primary thing. Scientists weren't wrong, they were just as in many things in science, it's important what question you ask, and what questions you don't ask makes a difference. And what happened is we got into a situation where policy decisions were made based on how to save lives. And what the general population was feeling was the cost and the risk of those interventions, not in lives saved, but in economic terms, in social terms, in not being able to see your friends smile because everybody's wearing a mask. And finally, we enter what I'm calling phase 3, or why isn't this thing cured yet, right? And this is where the COVID vaccine stuff starts coming into play. By now, the perceived risk of the disease has continued to drop, all right? By this point, a lot of people have probably already gotten it, and everybody has a friend who's gotten it, and most of these people are surviving. So in general, people are not seeing the disease as very high risk anymore. And so when you have a low risk disease and you're asking people to do interventions that are continuing to climb in their risk, all right, then people get ticked off. In this context, all of a sudden, hey, these vaccines come out. And you know what? They work really great. They protect against death and hospitalization. Everybody should get this thing. And again, this makes sense from a saving lives standpoint. Did the vaccines save a lot of lives? Absolutely. So the metric people were using, hospitalizations and saving lives, the vaccines were incredible. Saved so many lives, prevented so many hospitalizations. It makes sense to say, hey, everybody needs to get this vaccine. However, if the perceived risk of the disease is very low, no matter how good or effective an intervention like a vaccine is, it's not going to be perceived as effective. And anything that is imperfect about this intervention is going to be said, oh, well, is this even more risky than this thing I'm not feeling at risk for? If people have already had the disease and they said, hey, I was fine, why should I take this extra vaccine if, it doesn't even work for everybody, and now I'm gonna need to get a booster for it. So every little imperfection in the vaccine is seen as, oh, what the heck are we doing here? Because the perceived risk of the disease has gone down so much. Moreover, what did everybody really want out of the vaccine? They wanted to go back to work. They wanted to go out and play and see their friends. And what was happening is, from a policy standpoint, people kept the lockdowns, masks, etc. in place even after the vaccines were out there. And so now you're not even getting the benefits that people actually want, because the outcomes people want are these social, these economic things. So by the time we get these vaccines that are incredibly effective at saving lives and reducing hospitalizations, the general public is no longer most concerned about that, because the perceived risk of that has gone down overall. It doesn't matter how effective the intervention is or the vaccines are at saving lives if a lot of people don't feel like their lives are in danger. So that's why we have this disparity with medical science making a vaccine that does something extremely well, but in the context of policy that doesn't align with the interests of the general public, the perception can be that, oh, we did something wrong or things failed. So that's my general take on how science can have a huge success, but when it's paired with policy that doesn't align with general opinion, it can still seem like a failure.